In this video, we're going to take a look at Graf von Faber Castell Royal Blue. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. Right when I started writing with it, I felt like something was off for me, really immediately. And that's going to be my problem, really, because then I figured out what it was. Royal Blue. And royal blue as a tone of blue is not a tone that I really care for. I don't know that I've come across a royal blue that I've said, I really like this ink and want a bottle of it. So I'm going to try to put some of that aside here. Now, this does give some good tone variation and it shades really well in the writing. As an ink, it's very well behaved and easy to clean out of the pen, which you expect from a brand like Faber Castell. Now, again, it's just not my preference as a blue. As a royal blue, it is a really good one, and I can't say anything off with that because I know there's people out there that royal blue's the blue they want. I just see royal blue as a color looking a bit more washed out than I would prefer. Just as a color, it's more pale than I would expect, especially given its name. Now, I did say it shades well. I would like more, and yet I would be willing to give up all of the shading for this to be darker in how it performs and what it's doing, because I think I would like it better in that kind of a way. I just don't like royal blue. I have to stop getting them. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Retro 51 Tornado with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we're going to get no feather and no spread. It's going to perform very well on this paper. It's going to have really good shading throughout all of the writing. You see it constantly. I don't know that there's more than 2 letters without the tone of this changing in its shading. So it does really good with that if the blue wasn't royal blue. The medium is about the same tone as the fine with no feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. I don't think the shading is looking as good in the medium as it did with the fine, which is a little disappointing and surprising, but that is how it's looking. Now this broad nib, it's a Japanese broad, which means it writes more like a medium, but it's a bit wetter. And with that, it's much darker. I think it's looking much better here. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has a little bit of shading, not a whole lot, but it is kind of there. You see it in the 3 1/3. You see it in cows. You see it in away. So it's there and it's nice. I think it looks much better from that wet broad. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleed through and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Waterman graduate with a fine nib. A D-like alpha with a medium nib. A platinum 3776 with a broad nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, this is much darker in general than we saw in the Clairfontaine, and I like its tone here much more than I did on the previous paper. It has no feather, it has no spread, it still shades fairly well, not as frequently back and forth as we saw on the Clairfontaine, but it is definitely there throughout it. You get much darker words and much lighter words. I think this looks pretty good, despite my penmanship. The first two letters of the first word were started with the wrong pen, so that much darker area is a result of me going back over it with the medium. Now, the medium is lighter than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It really looks sun-bleached and uninteresting. It has very little shading, although it does show up. You can see it in the word anything that goes from a lighter to a light mid-tone. You see it in but, where it goes from light to a light mid-tone but. The broad is much darker than the medium. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has very little shading at all. In the word equations, you can see right at the Q to U, it gets darker, and at the A to T, it gets, or sorry, at the Q to U, it's lighter. It gets darker in the U and then lighter at the A to T. So it does pretty well when it's doing it. Looking at the back of the page, we get minor ghosting and no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, and fairly good shading. You can't have any kind of real complaint here. The tone itself is darker than what we got on the Clairfontaine, yet a bit lighter than what we got on the Leuchtterm. The medium is continuing to let me down as its tone is lighter than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. Yes, it technically has a few shading spots, but I don't know that I really want to call it shading, and I think the tone looks gross. The broad nib is much darker than the fine, certainly much, or darker than a fine, certainly much darker than the medium. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has some light shading. Look at the word irrationals compared to the word numbers right next to it. Entirely different things going on there. And the word irrationals changes tone from lighter to darker throughout the word. Looking at the back of the page, we get a minimal of ghosting and we got no bleeding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Here's a paper known to make inks look a little more dull, and it definitely does it here. The medium is much lighter than we were getting on the previous two papers, yet it is still a little darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. Curious. The fine has no feather, no spread. It does have light shading, only a few little bits of it, a light peppering of it, if you would. We'll call it seasoning, maybe, now. Keep things changing with the years of videos. The medium is much lighter than the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shade, it has no interest. It is uninteresting. Editorial moment, obviously. The broad nib is much darker than the medium. It's a bit darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has almost no shading. It also has no interest on this paper. This is really not a good ink to use on this paper because it looks really dull and uninteresting. I can't say that enough. Uninteresting. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and we get no bleed through, so it's got that going for it. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Royal Blue. Here is Mont Blanc Royal Blue. Here is Pelikan 4001 Royal Blue. Here is Waterman Serenity Blue. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. I'm going to take back the no feather because when I get to the third line of writing, you're going to see the interlardin as the word. It's going to be the last word on the third line. Also in the S's of essay, you see light, very light feathers, but this paper hasn't feathered a whole lot. We get no spread. We get no shading. We just get an uninteresting blue. The medium is much lighter in tone than the fine, with no feather, no spread. It does have a few moments of shading that show up. On his, you're going to see it go from a bit lighter to darker. In Scientific Approach, that entire line of writing, you see a bunch of color variation, and you do see some throughout it after. It's just unfortunate that the tone itself is lacking. The broad nib is by far the darkest tone on the page. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has no shading. And it is definitely a nice, rich blue to look at. If only the blue could look that way all the time. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and we got no bleed through. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a magenta ink by Ackerman, their Dutch Masters number 6. Here is an orange ink by Diamine, their Autumn Oak. Here is a pink ink by Sailor, their Gentle Pesh. Here is a yellow ink by Noodlers, their Golden Brown. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get some feathering all over it. You see it in method and could and achieve and if, Descartes, had. It's every word. It's all of it. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. No, it doesn't shade, but yes, you see tone variation in some of the writing. Some words are a little lighter than others, so it's kind of there. The medium is lighter than the fine, quite a bit lighter. It's gross as a tone. It does have feather. It does have spread. It does not have shading or interest. The broad nib is much darker than the medium, about the same tone as the fine. It has no feather or spread or shading. Now it has feather. It has spread. I don't know what I was thinking. It has feather, it has spread, it has no shading. But I think how this comes out looking with the fine and the broad are the most pleasing to look at considering the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we had nothing that came through and touched the page underneath. Now we get a normal amount of ghosting, so considering the paper, it's doing very good. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? My problem with choosing a pen for this ink is I don't want my blues to look washed out. So for me, I have to go with a very wet fine to really darken this up. Now, I'm going to do that sacrificing the shading so that I can get a tone that I would prefer. I need to remember that royal blue is a shade of blue I don't prefer. So any disappointment that I'm really having is my fault at this point. Does it mean that I'm not going to continue to make that mistake to see royal blues I'm disappointed with, but maybe can find the pen in the end? Yeah, I'm still going to do that. But I won't buy a bottle of royal blue because I need a gusher of a pen to get a tone I can live with. I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.